Hello, and welcome to Philosophy Live. I'm Graham Blackbourn from the Scottish branch of the School of Philosophy and Economic Science in Edinburgh. Thank you for joining me. The subject of today's talk is a remarkable scientist whom I've been fascinated with since watching on television as a child a 1940s film of her life, Marie Curie. At the time, my main interest was in her scientific discoveries, including that of radioactive elements, for which she is particularly well known. Many nowadays admire her for her persistence, as a woman, in achieving so much in what was definitely a man's world. But what I'd like to concentrate on here is her mental and emotional attitude, indeed her philosophy, which enabled her to achieve these things. Marie Curie, here's a photo of her. Marie Curie was born Maria Sklodowska in Warsaw in 1864. Warsaw historically was Polish, but at that time it was within the Russian Empire. After leaving school, Marie had attended the so-called Flying University, an underground institution, which not only was she able to attend as a woman, but it also sought to promote Polish values against the state pro-Russian agenda. In 1891, Maria followed her sister, Bronisława, to study in Paris, where she spent much of the rest of her life. Although she attained French citizenship through her marriage to Pierre Curie, it's clear that Marie's heart remained in Poland, which, towards the end of her life after the First World War, regained its independence. Marie's husband, Pierre, was himself a distinguished experimental physicist, and it was Pierre's admiration for Marie's scientific work which brought them together. Despite Pierre's own accomplishments, he does seem to have recognised that Marie was even brighter than he was, and he helped her to achieve the recognition due to her when the scientific community assumed that he, as a man, must have been the genius behind their joint or her own discoveries. It was Pierre's complaint to the Nobel Committee in 1903, when it intended to award a joint Nobel Prize for Physics to himself and Henri Becquerel, discoverer of X-rays, for their work on natural radiation, that Marie's name was added to the award. Becquerel had discovered in 1896 that uranium compounds emitted radiation rather like his X-rays, and Marie had decided to study these. Using measuring equipment first developed by Pierre and his brother, Marie found that the amount of radioactivity, a term she invented, depended only on the amount of uranium present, and therefore she hypothesized that it must come from the uranium atoms themselves. This was a significant step in showing that atoms are not indivisible, as had been assumed ever since they were first proposed by the ancient Greeks. She also found that uranium ore was much more radioactive than it should be on the basis of the amount of uranium within it, and she proposed that it must contain small amounts of other, more radioactive minerals, or other material. It was her Herculean effort in breaking down and processing tons of uranium ore, which I particularly remember from the 1940s film. She and Pierre eventually discovered two new elements. First, polonium, which she named after her beloved Poland, and then radium. They also noticed that diseased, tumorous cells were destroyed more rapidly than healthy cells when exposed to radium, leading in due course to radiotherapy. Marie suffered personal tragedy in 1906 when her beloved Pierre was killed in a road accident, but she continued her work. In 1911, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, making her the first person to win or share two Nobel Prizes, and one of only two people to win the prize in two separate disciplines. During the First World War, she recognized the importance to battlefield surgeons of the availability of X-rays, which could reduce the requirement for amputations, and she developed mobile radiography units, which became known as little Curies. By this time, she'd achieved international recognition, although, unfortunately, there's no time here to describe her other selfless humanitarian work. She died in 1934 at the age of 66, of aplastic anemia, often thought to have resulted from her work with radioactive elements. During her lifetime, both Marie and her husband had refused a number of awards and medals. The pursuit of scientific knowledge and the human good which could come from it seems always to have been more important to her than personal fame. Marie Curie was not known as a philosopher, and in the conventional sense she wasn't one. But she displayed qualities which we associate with the greatest of philosophers. Firstly, her fervent desire to discover the truth, which she placed above her own comfort and reputation. In her case, the truth about the nature of the world. And secondly, but this is not entirely separate, in her qualities as a human being. It's not easy to discover much about her own beliefs and motivations, since she was reluctant to speak about herself, being more interested in the science. It's said that on one occasion, on being asked by a reporter about herself, she told him to be less curious about people and more curious about ideas. In the early years of her research, she put up with working under atrocious conditions with very little support. A famous chemist, wishing to see the laboratory in which radium had recently been discovered, wrote, "The Curies themselves were away travelling. Their laboratory," that was Marie Curie, here's a picture of their laboratory. "Their laboratory was a cross between a stable and a potato cellar. And if I had not seen the work table with the chemical apparatus, I would have thought it was a practical joke." Shortly before this, Marie had written in a letter to her brother, "Life is not easy for any of us. But what of that? We must have perseverance, and above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted in something, and that this thing, at whatever cost, must be attained." Marie Curie, while appreciating the potential benefits of scientific advances, also saw them as valuable in themselves. I am among those who think that science has great beauty," she said to her daughter Eve. "A scientist in his laboratory is not only a technician, he is also a child placed before natural phenomena, which impress him like a fairy tale. We should not allow it to be believed that all scientific progress can be reduced to mechanisms, machines, gearings." Commenting on the medical benefits arising from her discoveries, she said, "We must not forget that when radium was discovered, no one knew that it would prove useful in hospitals. The work was one of pure science. And this is a proof that scientific work must not be considered from the point of view of the direct usefulness of it. It must be done for itself, for the beauty of the science. And then there's always a chance that a scientific discovery may become, like radium, a benefit to humanity." We occasionally get glimpses of Marie Curie's approach not only to science, but to life itself. She said, "We cannot hope to build a better world without improving the individual. Towards this end, each of us must work for his own highest development, accepting at the same time his share of responsibility in the general life of humanity." And towards the end of her life, she wrote in a letter to Irene, her eldest daughter, and also a Nobel Prize winning chemist and physicist, "The older one gets, the more one feels that the present moment must be enjoyed, comparable to a state of grace." But I can leave the final words about Marie Curie to someone who came to know her well. Albert Einstein wrote, "It was my good fortune to be linked with Madame Curie through 20 years of sublime and unclouded friendship. I came to admire her human grandeur, her strength, her purity of will, her austerity towards herself, her objectivity, her incorruptible judgment. All these were of a kind seldom found joined in a single individual. The greatest scientific deed of her life proving the existence of radioactive elements and isolating them, owes its accomplishment not merely to bold intuition, but to a devotion and tenacity in execution under the most extreme hardships imaginable. We may not discover profound new philosophical truths from Marie Curie's work, although she did contribute immensely to destroying the notion that the world is composed of inert particles of matter, bouncing off each other like billiard balls. The nature of physical reality has turned out to be much stranger. But it was her love of the beauty to be found in scientific truths, and her determination that nothing should prevent her from advancing towards understanding these truths, which I find inspiring. And she recognised that this goes hand in hand with one's own inner development as a human being, and in caring for others. In all of this, I believe it's fair to group Marie Curie amongst some of the world's greatest philosophers. And here's how philosophy might help us today. And thank you. Philosophy Live is on every Friday at the same time during the term on both Facebook and YouTube. We hope to see you next week for a new philosophical gem. Thanks again. Have a good evening and enjoy your weekend.